was probably 6 years ago.
I started to say it was still happening in 2011.
Yeah.
The first contract I ever worked on was the Defense Clarity Tool Suite. It was a Windsor based. And it was like a Yahoo Messenger for, the system itself was unclassed, but then the information, of course, just depending on whatever, it could have been classified or top secret or whatever. But the information from it went into the Northrop Grumman's GCCS, so they tracked all the vehicles and where they were on the battlefield and that kind of stuff. So you were talking about the information feeding over. So information from ours fed over to theirs and then back to ours, and it was not efficient at all. But then we lobbied, for our system, just like they did for theirs, and what they did eventually. I think the last time we worked on the DCTS contract was like they amended the contract to say that they own the system now, instead of it being proprietary. That way, somebody else couldn't come in on that system because it was something we created, and they started using commercial off-the-shelf products.
So did they have to buy that system from you to be able to use it?
They did.
So this is an example of another problem, okay? And I'll give you my scenario. So EDS won a contract with the Navy and Marine Corps. It was called the Navy Marine Corps Internet Contract. It was the largest IT buy in history. And it was originally awarded at, I think, $6.9 billion. And so I can't remember at the time whether we submitted a question about it or somebody else submitted a question. But the question was, we're going to go out, we understand the contract is to go out and put in computer systems at all Navy bases around the world. We get that. There's going to be intellectual property that gets developed as a result of that. Things like, wiring diagrams, schematics, processes, things that you will develop as a result of having to do this major contract. And we want to know whether the government wants to buy those rights, or if the government has considered buying those rights. And the government came back and said, basically, we can't afford it. It's already a huge deal. We only have X number of dollars. We're remaining silent on the question. So they didn't do anything about the intellectual property. Fast forward, EDS wins the contract. We go off merrily and put in all these networks and computers and big deal. And we get to the point where the contract was a 10-year contract, and we're in year 8. So at that point, the government, what does the government have to be thinking about?
Renewal.
Right, it's the renewal, the recompete. And so they started putting together the requirements, and they looked at the competitive field, and they saw, all these different companies that obviously want to get their piece of the action of this, $7 billion deal. And they realized, what did they realize when they looked at all the competition and they looked at EDS?
You were the only one that had all this proprietary information.
We owned all this proprietary. So what did we have that they didn't have?
The keys to the car.
Right, we had the competitive advantage. And the government couldn't do a request for proposal until they leveled the playing field. Because remember what we talked about, the government procurement objective is an equitable procurement. It wasn't equitable when we had all the intellectual property and no one else did. So at year 8 of the contract, and year 9 of the contract, and year 10 of the contract, and year 11 of the follow-on contract, and even year 2 of the follow-on contract, guess what we had to do? We, EDS, had to figure out how to price that intellectual property, and the government had to come up with the funds to buy that intellectual property. Where do you think they would have gotten a cheaper price? At the beginning of that first contract, or by the end, where we had to, it took so long to even just classify, to categorize all the data that we had in order to be able to sell it to the government. So my point is that the same example you had. There are things that in hindsight make perfect sense, and in this case, either us or some other vendor thought about that and asked the question, but the government, because of their constraints financially, couldn't pursue that, and it became a huge problem at the end. Huge. So you'll see that kind of thing all the time. The other thing I want to say is, I don't want to get too specific, but if I asked who was in their 20s, who would raise their hand? Who's in their 30s? Who's in their 40s? Who's in their 50s? Am I the only one in their 50s? Okay, so you have the same kind of age spectrum, and if I continued, 60s and 70s, you have that same age spectrum that are contracting officers in the government. So the people who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s that are still doing contract work, their brain is stuck where?
In the 80s.
Right. I always did it this way. And you know what? If I just do it myself, it becomes really, it's much easier because I can manage all aspects of it. If I start getting into using GSA schedules or doing this, that can, I don't really know that. And some government people, and I don't want to pin this on government people because the same thing happens in the contractor community. Some people get to a certain age and they're like, I don't want to learn anything else. I'm done, been there, that's it. And as a result, they're stuck in a way of doing things that isn't moving in the future directions. But then you have, the 20-year-olds who are saying, this is crazy, let's just, it's going to be easier if I use GSA because all I have to do is pay an industrial funding fee and call it done. So my point in telling you that is everybody you're dealing with in the government is not the same. And depending on who you get, you might be using the latest and greatest, or you might be using the very antiquated. So you need to keep that in mind. Like when people go get GSA schedules, I consult companies to help them get GSA schedules. In fact, I'm working with a brand new client starting this morning. And, I said to her, the thing you have to keep in mind is that GSA is the area where they bring all the contracting interns to, because GSA does more contracting than any other agency, because they're contracting for products and services. When you win a GSA schedule, you don't win any money. You don't get any money when you get a GSA schedule. All you get is a fishing license. Now you can go sell to all the other agencies. You can't just go sell to all the other agencies unless you have that fishing license. So GSA, because there's not any dollars associated, they're contracting all over the place to get you into the government fold. So some agencies use GSA all the time. That's all they use because it's so much easier to buy through GSA. But some agencies are kind of stuck. The other thing to keep in mind is when these new regulations come out. So 2 years ago, maybe 3.5 years ago, there was something called FTARA, Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act. And around the Beltway, it was considered the most significant piece of legislation in the IT space in 20 years. So this was a big deal. And there were a whole bunch of things that were required from FTARA that agencies were required to do, and different methods of doing that. The problem is somebody up here, in this case Congress, said, agencies, thou shalt do this. But the agencies didn't get the training they needed, didn't have the resources to implement what they were doing. So there's always this lag time between when somebody on high says to go do something and how it gets implemented. Here's the scary example of that. I worked with a doctoral student who was looking at, how many people served in the military? Did you always have the supplies? Did you have everything you needed when you were deployed? Okay, so here's why they didn't have everything. Now, think about this. we American citizens send these two gentlemen off to foreign lands to protect and defend our interests both nationally and abroad, and we don't give them what they need over there. And the reason why we don't give them what we need was what one of my students decided to do her doctoral dissertation on. So she worked at Fort Belvoir, which is DLA headquarters, Defense Logistics Agency. They're the ones that supply these guys with everything they're supposed to have over there. Thank you for your service, by the way. And what she found when she was looking at this is that there were mandates that were happening on high that didn't get filtered down to the people who were actually implementing things. So if somebody up here decided this was going to be a ground assault, and that word didn't get down here, chances are they didn't get the tanks they needed, or they didn't get the munitions or the guns that they needed. It became a very, and what she looked at was across the board. Like, I looked at her data, it's amazing you got anything over there. I mean, that's how bad it was. And it's because, you know, directions are coming in from all sides, some of it's, in other words, it wasn't this formal chain of command that you would have expected to have, okay, here's our mission, what we're trying to accomplish, here's operationally what we need, here's tactically what we need, and here's what the troops need to have in their hands in order to be successful. So the kinds of assumptions that we think about as logical, prudent business people, they don't have the data, they don't have the tools, we're not funding them for that stuff, they're not getting enough education. There's a lot going on in the government as to why all that stuff's not happening. And before I get too depressing, let's take a break and we'll come back in 10 minutes. If you have any other questions, we'll